There is a silence that enters between two people, not always sudden, but like a shadow stretching with the setting sun. When intimacy begins to fade, it does not announce itself with thunder, but with the quiet absence of presence. Eyes that once held wonder become mirrors of habit. Words that once felt alive now echo through the corridors of routine. Human connection is like a living garden. It blooms when tended to, and withers when ignored. Intimacy is not just physical closeness. It is the meeting of energies, the alignment of hearts, the willingness to see and be seen without disguise. But in the pursuit of careers, goals, survival, and distractions, many forget to water this delicate garden. The result is a slow drift, where partners become strangers wearing familiar faces. When this distance appears, the first reaction is often blame, but the fading of intimacy is rarely the fault of one. It is the result of a mutual sleepwalking, a forgetting of shared presence. The invitation is to awaken, to return, not to who the other was, but to who both have become. The practice lies not in forcing the old flame, but in rediscovering the new light that now flickers. Stillness can be healing. In the quiet, one must listen not just to the partner, but to oneself. What have I stopped sharing? What have I stopped seeing? Intimacy fades when appreciation fades. It fades when listening stops. It fades when assumptions replace inquiry, but like a fire that seems extinguished, it can be revived. If there is still warmth, still care, still willingness, remember that the fading of intimacy is not always the end. Sometimes it is a beginning, a calling to rebuild a new bridge where the old one has worn thin. But this requires courage, presence, and vulnerability, to show up again, not to what was, but to what is, and what could be. When intimacy fades, it does not vanish in a single moment. It drifts quietly and unnoticed, like the final rays of sunlight as evening approaches. In the beginning, there is warmth. There is attentiveness in the eyes, a curiosity in the heart, and a willingness to meet the other person, not only with words, but with presence. But over time, this presence can become routine. What was once sacred becomes familiar, and what was once familiar slowly becomes ignored. The fading of intimacy is often not due to a lack of love, but rather a lack of awareness. Two people may live under the same roof, speak the same words, and perform the same rituals. But the connection, the subtle thread that binds heart to heart, becomes strained. There is a shift from engaging to enduring. A smile becomes a habit rather than a gesture. A touch becomes functional rather than affectionate. To understand this fading is to first recognize how easily we begin to take people for granted. Attention is a gift. Presence is a discipline. And when those are no longer consciously offered, the relationship begins to mirror a still lake, peaceful on the surface, but with no movement underneath. This is where silence becomes louder than words. When nothing is said, but everything is felt, intimacy fades when the conversation of the soul is replaced by the noise of distraction. Reconnection, then, is not about grand gestures. It is about returning to the moment, listening without preparing to reply, and seeing the other person not as they were, but as they are now. Rebuilding intimacy begins with awareness, and awareness begins in stillness. When the connection between two people begins to weaken, it often starts with something imperceptible, like a shift in the wind, not in action but in intention, not in what is done but in how it is done. What once came from a place of deep care and presence now begins to emerge from obligation or habit. The cup of tea offered without eye contact, the shared meals eaten in silence, the words exchanged that carry no weight. These are the silent signs of intimacy slipping into the background. We must remember that intimacy is not sustained by physical proximity alone. Two people can sit side by side and still feel 1,000 miles apart. True closeness is not measured by distance, but by depth. And depth only exists where there is honesty, presence, and vulnerability. The willingness to show up not only with our strengths, but also with our fears, doubts, and imperfections. But often we are taught to suppress, to remain strong, to hold back what might disturb the peace. Over time, this suppression becomes a wall, and what began as small, unsaid things becomes a barrier too wide to cross. In this way, silence grows, not as peace, but as avoidance. To reverse this fading, one must first find the courage to speak, not loudly, not with anger, but with softness and truth, to ask gently, where are we? And are we still truly seeing each other? This is not a confrontation, it is an invitation. A door being opened, for when words come from the heart, they do not wound, they illuminate, and with enough light, even the darkest corners of disconnection can be seen, and slowly, gently, brought back to life. Sometimes what fades is not love itself, but the expression of love. In the beginning, we communicate often, we listen deeply, and we notice even the smallest gestures from the other. But as time passes, routines take over. We assume, we expect, we stop paying attention, and without attention, no relationship can truly thrive. Intimacy requires presence, not just being physically near someone, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually present. It is when you look into someone's eyes and truly see them, not as a reflection of your expectations, but as they are in that very moment. When this presence fades, a distance is created, even if you share the same bed or speak daily. And so, many begin to feel invisible in their own relationships, not because they are unloved, but because they are unseen, not because words are missing, but because meaning is. This leads to withdrawal, a silent retreat of the heart. One partner pulls back slightly, hoping the other will notice, will reach out. But the other is also lost in their own thoughts, their own weariness. So both drift silently, unknowingly, until one day the gap feels too wide to cross. To maintain intimacy, we must continuously choose it. Choose to listen even when tired. Choose to touch even when words feel difficult. Choose to ask questions even when the answers may challenge us. These small acts are not dramatic, yet they carry immense power. Like drops of water that shape stone over time, small gestures of care can restore even the most silent love. It is not the grand declarations that sustain intimacy, but the quiet constancy of presence. The willingness to return again and again to the moment, to one another, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Intimacy does not fade overnight. It withers slowly, like a flame left unattended. One of the most subtle yet damaging forces behind this fading is distraction. In today's world, attention is pulled in countless directions. Screens glow late into the night. Thoughts remain entangled in work or worries, and moments once shared now pass in silence. When two people no longer offer their full attention to each other, a quiet emptiness begins to grow in the space between them. True intimacy is built on presence, and presence requires effort. It is the art of pausing, even in the middle of a busy day, to look someone in the eye and ask, "How are you really?" It is about listening without the urge to fix, solve, or respond immediately. It is about creating space where both feel safe to show their joys and their fears without judgment or interruption. But when one or both partners become consumed by external noise, these moments begin to vanish. Sometimes we believe that intimacy is only about physical closeness, but when distraction becomes constant, even touch feels distant. A hug becomes a habit, a kiss becomes routine. There is movement, but no connection. And slowly, the bond that once felt alive begins to feel mechanical, as if two strangers are going through the motions of love. To reclaim intimacy, one must first reclaim attention. Turn off the devices. Set aside the burdens of the day. Sit with your partner not to discuss, but to be. Notice their breath. Notice their silence. In this stillness, the heart can speak. In this pause, connection can be rebuilt. When distraction ends, intimacy begins to breathe again, slowly, softly, but with great power. When intimacy fades, often what remains is silence, not the peaceful kind that brings comfort, but the silence that speaks of distance, of things left unsaid, of emotions buried too deep. At the heart of this silence is often the unspoken pain of unmet expectations. We enter relationships carrying dreams, desires, and a longing to be seen fully. Over time, when those needs are not acknowledged or nurtured, a quiet disappointment takes root. And met expectations are not always voiced clearly. Sometimes they live as subtle disappointments, a glance not returned, a word not spoken, a moment where one hoped to be held but wasn't. These seem small on their own, but when repeated over weeks and years, they begin to shape the emotional climate of the relationship. The heart begins to close, not out of anger, but out of quiet resignation. One might ask, how can something as sacred as love become burdened by such silence? The answer lies in how little we are taught to speak our truth with kindness and clarity. We suppress feelings for the sake of peace, but that peace becomes a wall. We avoid difficult conversations to protect harmony, but that harmony becomes hollow. To restore intimacy, we must return to honesty, not the harsh kind that wounds, but the gentle truth that frees. Speak not to accuse, but to reveal. Share not to demand, but to invite understanding. When both partners begin to express their hidden truths, intimacy has the chance to return, not as something forced, but as something reborn. It is not the absence of flaws that sustains connection, but the willingness to face them together with compassion. In this mutual courage, silence is transformed back into shared presence, and what was once fading can begin to live again. And so, when intimacy fades, it is not always the end, but often a quiet call to return, to remember, and to rebuild. Beneath the silence, the disconnect, and the unmet expectations lies a still beating heart that longs to be heard, understood, and held once more. It is not the absence of struggle that defines a meaningful connection, but the choice to meet each other again in the space where distance once grew. Through patience, truth, and a renewed willingness to listen not just with the ears, but with the soul, the bond can heal. And in that healing, intimacy no longer remains a memory, but becomes a living, breathing presence once again.